Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Blackface. It's hardly a word one would have thought to be heard in the 21st century. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. The term has been thrust into the headlines with a political storm that has washed over top politicians in the state of Virginia. Governor Ralph Northam's medical school yearbook shows someone in blackface standing next to someone in robes of the Ku Klux Klan. At the top of the page is the governor's name. First, he apologized and denied he was in the picture, but did say that he appeared in blackface to imitate Michael Jackson. As denunciations and calls for his resignation gushed forth, the state attorney general, Mark Herring, admitted that he too had appeared in blackface as a rapper. White's appearing in blackface reaches back to the 19th century in America, but has also reappeared in recent comedy sketches on such programs as Saturday Night Live. To say the least, there has been a backlash against these kinds of images in the wake of the Virginia scandals. We take a look at the history and significance of the current national attention to this issue. We have in our studio this morning Dr. Joshua Wright, Associate Professor at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. He is an author and historian and has followed the image of African Americans in the United States. And welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
So first of all, just sort of on a personal level, what was your reaction as this scandal unfolded, first with Governor Northam, and then we had Mark Herring as well?
Honestly, I wasn't surprised. This type of thing's been happening quite a bit, and if you follow social media, you see so many blackface parties happening on college campuses, fraternities, sororities, Halloween parties. So seeing the governor do it, really didn't shock me at all. And then also given Virginia's history, going back to the Civil War and earlier. And then, you had Charlottesville, which just in Virginia, about a year or two ago. So it really didn't shock me at all.
So let's go back to a little history here, because the blackface really emerges with the minstrel shows. I understand actually somebody was an actor in New York, actually, who created some of these. Tell us a little bit about the what seems now ancient history.
Right. So the term minstrel actually comes from an art form that was popularized in medieval Europe. All right, and then when you talk about blackface in the minstrel shows here in the United States, that really comes into play around the 1820s. You have Thomas D. Rice and then George Washington Dixon were two of the earliest known blackface performers. And it should be known in the very beginning when they started doing the blackface, we think of it now as men imitating the southern voice of the blacks or the Negroes, as they called them back then on the southern plantations. But initially, they were imitating black people, but the routines, they sounded more like English white men when they did it in the very beginning. Now, Dixon, the story is that Thomas Rice, he traveled through the South and he saw this black man who had physical issues from arthritis and different things. And I don't know if the gentleman was dancing, but he saw this and then he imitated that on stage. So the song Jump Jim Crow, that's where this originates. And if you've seen pictures of the Jim Crow character, that's where he's taken this from. So then you have these guys, and as I say, this is in the 1820s. In the 1830s and the 1840s, blackface minstrelsy really starts to take off, particularly in the North. People think of it as a Southern art form, but it really rose in the North in places such as New York City, and Boston, and Philadelphia. And it would eventually become the most popular form of entertainment and pop culture within America. And it's also important when you think about the fact that, while this is something that's Southern, that is happening in the North. And you have to ask yourself, well, why the North and why the Northeast in particular, and why these particular places and this time frame? So if we look at history, during this time you have immigration. You have Irish coming over and other immigrants coming, and they're experiencing racism. So on the North, you have this upheaval of these new immigrants coming. You have the Nativist Party forming. You have people who are afraid that these immigrants are going to take away their jobs, that they're going to lead to crime, lead to all sorts of different problems. At the same time, you also have abolition taking place, and Northerners calling for the abolition and the ending of slavery in the South. So it's a very uneasy time, not just for Southerners, but for Northerners as well. So the minstrelsy kind of comes about, I don't want to say in response to that, but as part of that. And then also some have said that the minstrels was a way for these immigrants to actually almost assimilate into mainstream white culture, because one of the earliest minstrel performers who gained great success and notoriety was this gentleman named Dan Emmett, who was of Irish descent, and he had the first known minstrel troupe called the Virginia Minstrels. All right, so I think that's really important that you frame it within that history.
And it seems as if, in terms of performers, that you not only have the Irish, but then other immigrants as well take on those roles.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And again, like I say, it's all about allowing them a access almost into the mainstream society and into the culture by adopting these racist stereotypes. Now, the thing about the minstrelsy, and here's a really great quote, and I wrote it down so I don't want to misquote him, but the author is Eric Lott, and he had this great quote where he refers to blackface as the strange mix of envy, fascination, desire, and fear. And I think that's so powerful, because you look at it, it's like, okay, so number one, these people are fascinated by these African Americans, these Southerners that they don't know very much about and they haven't had a lot of contact with. Maybe they desire somewhat to duplicate their dance, to duplicate the singing. Envious, I'm not quite sure about the envious part, but the fear, again, you could see how people would be afraid, because as we're talking now in the 1840s, and then later we get into the 1850s, and you have the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and you're talking about abolition. You have folks like Abraham Lincoln talking about abolition and ending slavery. Then there's that fear of, well, what happens if these people are freed, if they're emancipated, and now they're competing for jobs, not just in the South, but maybe they migrate, as we know they do later with the Great Migration. Maybe they migrate to the North, and now they're competing with us for jobs as well. So it's very complex.
What kinds of characters are we looking at in terms of these minstrel shows? I mean, we have obviously Jim Crow, who's so this dancer in tattered clothes, but what other kinds of stereotypes that seem to resonate, as I began to sort of look at some of the literature, even resonate to this day?
Right. So one of the popular stereotypes would be the dandy. Okay, and the name they often give was Zip Coon. So the dandy represented the more educated, middle-class black person who lived in the North, and they really made him out to be a buffoon, though. He's speaking with a big vocabulary, and he's misusing words or mispronouncing them. With his clothes, he'll have on these ridiculously long dress coats, top coats, I should say, and top hats. He might have on the white gloves, and we definitely want to talk about the white gloves later, because that's a really important thing. He may have a pocket watch, or a watch chain, I should say. So they would make fun of this character. And out of this, the Zip Coon, and then you hear the term coon. So there's this book, Toms, Coons, and Mulattoes by Donald Bogle, who's a black historian, and he wrote about the history of black film, and he also did a book called Primetime Blues about the history of black television. But what he talks about is with these coon characters, these are comical figures. And minstrelsy was about comedy. That's the thing. It was a comedy, so white audiences could watch the minstrels and they could laugh and they could enjoy it, and they didn't feel threatened at all, because again, it was a comedy. So the coon character is somebody that would live on. So as you get into the 30s and the 40s, and you'll have films and stars such as Step It, Fetch It, that's the coon. Amos and Annie, that's the coon. And even modern day, and this is somewhat problematic, even modern day, people would try to call certain black comedians coons based on how they perform, and it's always this kind of push and pull, because you don't really know exactly, like, is this person really cooning, meaning are they playing on like these stereotypical images of black people just to get laughs from whites in the mainstream, or are they just being funny? And you've heard the coon term used for, people from Dave Chappelle to Kevin Hart and Tyler Perry, and again, that's something, maybe we'll get into that later on, and then you have other stereotypes that are going to come out as well. Later, as you get into films such as the Mammy character and some of those. And let me just point out this with the gloves. I was talking about how they would wear those white gloves, right, with the dandy. So minstrelsy, and I don't know if a lot of people notice, but minstrelsy also helped to shape early cartoons in Disney, And Looney Tunes. Before there was Looney Tunes, it actually was called Merry Melodies. Okay, so you think about Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd and all of those things, right? Jay-Z, the rapper, he did this video about a year or two ago called "The Story of O.J." And the video is it's a play on O.J. Simpson and something
Right.
O.J. Simpson said some years back. But the video is a cartoon and it has all this racist imagery. And the main character in the cartoon is named Jabbo, which is like a play on the word Sambo. And you'll notice his character has on the white gloves, and that's harkening back to Disney. So you see Mickey Mouse with the white gloves, the eyes, the big eyes, the lips. Early depictions of Mickey Mouse. Bugs Bunny. You'll see Bugs Bunny with the same thing with the white gloves. There's some early cartoons, and a lot of these have been banned, but you could pull them up on YouTube and you could actually watch them. So they're like some early cartoons where you'll see Mickey Mouse actually in blackface in some of those cartoons. And a lot of the violence, and we look at it and we don't really think of it. We think, that's funny, those cartoons are kind of violent if you look back at some of them, right? So a lot of that was a play on some of the comedic violence that was used within the minstrel shows, which again was a play on the violence on the southern plantations, but it was making it comical. And it's important to note that like these cartoons really start becoming popular in the 1930s and the 40s, around the time when the more traditional minstrel show with actual real life people doing it was dying out. Yeah.
So let me ask you this. So the Civil War comes along, and obviously the slaves are freed, at least from bondage. How does the minstrel show then begin to change, or how does it grow more? And obviously, eventually, we have the adoption of the label Jim Crow laws.
Yeah. So, and that's a great question. So, with the Civil War, you will start to see a shift in terms of the content within the minstrel shows. In fact, a number of the shows stopped focusing so much on the black characters during that time period. So, they would have more universal characters and more universal storylines. And then what happens is around the 1850s and 1860s, then you also start to see the appearance of black actors in these minstrel shows. So prior to this, it was the white gentleman blackening with the cork and the grease paint and everything like that. Now you have the black actors getting involved. And that will also make a big shift in minstrelsy, because it's this notion that, before you had white actors pretending to be Southern Negroes, but now you have the blacks doing it, and the blacks are more natural because they're black, right? So, the songs they're singing, the dances they're doing, et cetera, I mean, that's natural to them. So it was almost this argument of, why do we even need to have white actors doing minstrelsy anymore when we have black actors? Now, people will say, why in the world would a black actor do minstrelsy if it's demeaning? Keep in mind, so there are reasons for that. Number one, those are the only options. You really didn't have, if you wanted to make money, you had to do that. So you didn't really have an option. Number two, and this is also important, for a lot of these black actors, they call it wearing the mask. And Paul Laurence Dunbar, the famous black poet, he did this poem in 1899 called "We Wear the Mask," and he talks about black. And it wasn't about minstrelsy, but he used to say black people have to wear this mask. They have to smile and grin when they aren't really happy, and they have to look content when they're hurting and they're in pain to deal with society. That kind of like the double consciousness that Du Bois talks about. W.B. Du Bois talks about this double consciousness of trying to be, black and then also being American at the same time, right? And having that burden on you. So for these black actors, wearing a mask almost made them less threatening to the white audiences watching them. Because the white audiences, when they saw that black mask, they just saw a comic figure. So they weren't offended and they weren't threatened by the fact that these were black men who were up there performing for them. You're also going to get the emergence of folks such as Burt Williams a little later and at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. And Burt Williams is very important to minstrelsy because he becomes the first internationally known black superstar. Now some people say that he at one point was making more money than the president. I would have to fact check that, but that's what some folks have said. He was the first black actor to be on Broadway. And the thing about Burt Williams, so he's the gentleman of West Indian descent, comes from the Bahamas. He gets involved in minstrelsy. He's very fair-skinned also. He wasn't a dark-skinned man at all. And with what he did that was different from the white actors in the past who were doing minstrelsy, and even some of the black minstrels, is the fact that he considered himself humanizing that racial stereotype. It's almost like this. So, I'm sure like many of your listeners are familiar with the movie The Help from a few years back. It was a book first, and then it became a movie, won many awards. Okay, so the black actresses who starred in The Help said that, they realized that there was going to be backlash within the black community because some people said, you guys are glorifying that mammy figure. Think about Going with the Wind and Mammy. You guys are glorifying that mammy figure, this black maid. But what they said they were doing was they were trying to humanize those people and actually give them some dignity and really like tell their stories from a multidimensional perspective. So with Burt Williams, that's what he was trying to do with the minstrels and with the blackface. He said, okay, I'm not going to exaggerate the speech of African Americans. I'm not going to exaggerate the dance and the song. I'm going to do it from a realistic standpoint. Yes, I'm in blackface, and that actually became something that he was accustomed and known for, was being in blackface. But he's saying that I'm going to bring it some dignity. And even after his shows, a lot of times he would allow the media to come in and watch him take the makeup off so they could see this transformation from him as this blackface character to like what he actually looked like. And again, when you saw him in person, he was a fair-skinned man, spoke very good English and grammar, and he was a big superstar. But over time he would become somewhat of an outcast because people saw him representing minstrelsy in something that was negative. And it wasn't until later in the 70s when people started to kind of look at him differently and actually say, well, no, he was a trailblazer who had to do certain things to pave the way for African-American comics and entertainers.
So I want to turn to the 20th century, particularly this period. You have the birth of the nation, actors in blackface in 1915. You obviously had Woodrow Wilson, who segregated the military, was a racist himself, and also is this also a period of height really of the Ku Klux Klan marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. How does the blackface fit into that what seems to me almost the height, as it were, of a number of different trends?
Okay. Yeah, so Birth of a Nation is a popular film, as you said. Woodrow Wilson views it in the White House, and then you talk about the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan, really comes into being after the Civil War during the Reconstruction period. They die out because you have Ulysses S. Grant passing Ku Klux laws and Congress getting involved, so the Klan dies out. Birth of a Nation is a successful movie. It's the first movie in history, and it depicts the Civil War and the Reconstruction from the Confederate viewpoint. It's actually based on a book called The Klansmen. So with this film in 1915, it leads to the rebirth of the Klan. So by the time you get into the 1920s, the Klan is running politics in many states, and you have a Klans member who was in the Supreme Court, et cetera, et cetera. As far as the way that blackface plays into this, if you watch the film Birth of a Nation, and everybody should take a look at it, it's on YouTube, you'll see white actors in blackface pretending to be the black Union soldiers. There's a really horrifying scene where one of the soldiers wants to marry this white woman, and she refuses him, and then he chases after her, and they run through the forest, and she runs up to the top of a cliff and jumps off and kills herself. And in the movie, they use that as what leads to the creation of the Ku Klux Klan. That's not true, but that's how they depict it in the movie. And then in the film, you see blacks, in Congress, and they're drinking liquor, and they got their shoes off, and they're passing laws to say black men and white women could get married. And, so that's where you see blackface, very prominent within that film. Now, again, as I said, once you start to get into the 1930s, blackface starts to, the minstrel shows are, no longer a thing in American pop culture. Now, blackface is still with us, though. But, you don't see people on Broadway and on stages anymore. You'll see it more so in films. Amos and Andy was a popular radio series in the 1930s, started by two white men. And, it started out on the radio, and these white guys are pretending to be black men, and they're speaking with the exaggerated voices that you would have heard in the minstrels. And in fact, they learned that from watching minstrel shows. They made a film about Amos and Andy, and the men played the characters, and they were in blackface. And then later, Amos and Andy actually becomes a TV series in the early 50s. It's the first TV series with an all-black cast. The NAACP boycotts the show and gets it taken off the air. But the black characters who were in the TV series, it's funny, like they were told how to talk and how to act by the white creators. So they're saying, you're not speaking black enough. You need to talk like this, or this is how you need to walk. And again, Amos and Andy was a very, very polarizing show within the African American community, and like I say, it was taken off the air and banned for almost like 3 decades.
Just briefly, should touch on Al Jolson, who made his career as blackface, and towards the end of his career did not realize or did not understand why people objected. What was his story there?
So Al Jolson's story is actually somewhat complicated, right? We tend to hear that name Al Jolson thrown around quite a bit. Even recently on Saturday Night Live, they did a skit about the blackface case in Virginia, and one of the characters mentioned Al Jolson as his hero. So Al Jolson was this actor, entertainer of Jewish descent who is famous for this film, The Jazz Singer, right? And most people call this the first, talkie, or the first movie with sound and talking, right? And in the film, he, leaves his family and he goes off to become he becomes a jazz singer. And there's scenes where he's in blackface and he's performing, and the famous scene is where he sings the song Mammy. Now, a lot of people, look at Al Jolson and say, well, that's the prime example of, white appropriation and cultural appropriation and white people doing blackface. But the reason I say he's complicated is because off the set, Jolson was also known for helping black actors and black playwrights. There was a black playwright, and he helped him actually get his play produced. There was some times where black actors were discriminated against. I forget the gentleman's names, but they were discriminated against at a restaurant. Jolson heard about it, and he got involved, and came to their aid. When Jolson passed away, you had some blacks who actually attended the funeral, and then you had some in the black press who actually wrote positive critiques of his performances in blackface. So that's what I say, he's a complicated character. In one sense, people will say, well, that Mammy is very racist and it's very demeaning. And then others will say, well, he did that, but then he also was doing certain things that was seen as positive in the black community too. It's just like with Burt Williams, who I was mentioning earlier. Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, they said glowing things about Burt Williams in his day. But then you also had people in the black press who were saying that, why are you doing this? You're demeaning the black community and not uplifting the race by performing in blackface.
I want to turn to the 1980s because that's where both certainly the governor and lieutenant governor did their thing when it comes to blackface. And I was reading where there was a suggestion that there was a revival of blackface on college campuses during the period.
And I heard that, again, going back to SNL, they had this joke where they kept saying, well, it was okay in the 80s, so personally, I don't really get that, the whole, the 80s thing and why that would even, I have some theories as to maybe why, just because I don't want to get too political, but certain things were happening politically at that time in the country, so I could see maybe why some people would start to get into it. What I do know, though, was, after you start getting out of that time period, you do see blackface more and more, as you say, on the college campuses, at the parties. And if you don't mind, I like to try to give a really, really quick timeline of some things from the 80s up through the present to show how blackface has still been with us, right? So there was a film called Soul Man, which came out, I believe, in the late 80s, early 90s, and you had this white guy who is applying to go to Harvard University, and in order to get into the school, under affirmative action, he blackens up. So that's, a case of blackface in Hollywood and in the media. You have, obviously, later on you have the Tropic Thunder film. Now, that's not until 2008 with Tropic Thunder. I think that's important, too, though, because you have Robert Downey Jr., who plays in blackface the whole film. And throughout the movie, there's a black character who's calling him out on it, saying, this is so ridiculous and this is so stupid. And one of the things about that movie that's controversial was directed by Ben Stiller. The movie, the DVD, they had a feature on the DVD where they apologize to the public. They give a PSA, but the PSA had nothing to do with the blackface. The PSA had to do with the fact that they used retarded and retard throughout the movie. So they're like, well, don't use the R word. But there was nothing at all about the blackface. All right. Throughout the 80s, 90s, throughout that time period, you have the Zulu crew at the Mardi Gras parades. Now, this is something that actually goes back, many, many decades at Mardi Gras, where you have these entertainers in blackface, and they still do it to this day, despite people saying that, this is offensive and this is wrong. Now, most of the people who do it are black actors, but you have some white actors who are involved as well, and they don't see it as racist. They see this as being a part of their culture. And they also just see it as something that's good-natured and fun. I know we're focusing on America, but overseas in the Netherlands, when they have their annual, when they stop doing it, but they have their annual St. Nicholas Day, think St. Nicholas, you think of Santa Claus here in America, they have this character, it's a children's character by the name of Black Pete. And Black Pete was a character in blackface, and Black Pete would come down the chimney like with Santa, and if the kids were bad, then Black Pete would punish them. So on the holiday, people would dress up in blackface to imitate Black Pete. And even the Prime Minister in Belgium, I remember he talked about, and this is funny because you talked about Northam, the Prime Minister in Belgium talked about how, it was so hard to get the paint off of his face. But he didn't find anything offensive with it. Right. You have restaurants throughout the U.S. There's a Sambo's restaurant. Now, Sambo's, again, comes from that famous character Sambo. You had 47 states in the U.S. who had chains of the Sambo's restaurants, but that dies out once you start to get into the early 80s. But then there was still Mammy's Cupboard, which is a restaurant in Mississippi, and there's a big Mammy outside of the restaurant shaped like a Mammy. Right. And you walk in the door. Now, that still exists today. Coming back to the films, again, I mentioned Tropic Thunder. Robert Downey Jr., 2008, gets an Oscar nomination around the same time that President Obama is sworn into office as our first black president in the United States. And then later on, there are other examples, whether it's Jimmy Kimmel in blackface doing Oprah, doing the basketball player Karl Malone on Comedy Central's The Man Show.
I was going to ask you, by the way, because there was criticism. Billy Crystal, for instance, does Sammy Davis Jr. Fred Armisen played obviously Obama and Prince and Darkened. Some have suggested that the context for those particular characters is different in the sense that I think it was Armisen who said that he felt comfortable because he wasn't trying to create a stereotype of some kind. What about that? Obviously, they're dramatically different than the original minstrel shows, but I mean,
That's still problematic, though. It's still problematic because then that's the same issue that's the reason why people had a problem with the governor of Virginia putting on some paint to look like Michael Jackson. Yeah. Or the reason why people had an issue with Herring from Virginia, Mark Herring, right, doing, Curtis Blow, the rapper. And then that comes back to this whole issue of the kids at the college campuses doing blackface. UCLA, they had Sigma Phi Epsilon, which is a fraternity, and then Alpha Phi sorority in 2015 in UCLA had a Kanye West Western where the kids were supposed to be imitating Kanye West, the rapper, and then his wife, Kim Kardashian. But then they also started imitating, black gangster rappers. And they didn't look at that as we're poking fun. This is like, hey, we're just doing this. There's a woman on one of those Real Housewife reality shows who, got done up as Diana Ross. Megyn Kelly, who got fired from NBC even mentioned this. Right. She was saying, well, she wanted to look like Diana Ross, and she put on some spray tan, and darkened up a little bit, and put on a wig, and that's an homage to Diana Ross. That's not, that's not racist. But that's the problem, because, again, people started doing this, and for them it may not be racist because they don't know that history and that pain that comes along with it for folks who might look like me, who may see that and think, you don't really have to do that. You could imitate the person, but you don't have to darken your skin to imitate that person.
Well, perhaps to finish with a quote from Amia Moody Ramirez, who's a professor, and she said, if you have to think about it and ask if it's okay, then it probably is not okay. I appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us and give us really this rich history about blackface and the minstrel and its significance to this day.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Well, we've been speaking with Dr. Joshua Wright, who's associate professor at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. And this has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.